So I suppose the first person I'd like to direct my first question to is Alison in Washington. And I mean, as we all know, yesterday, and one of the reasons we're having the meeting today is because of the new peacekeeping operation which was launched yesterday, or the taking over from the African Union by MINUSCA of peacekeeping responsibilities. And interestingly enough, while protection of civilians was expected to be, by all of us, to be its main priority, the mission's inaugural tweet states the following: the key priority of UN and CAR is to support the political process and conclude the country's transition. So there's no mention of protection in that inaugural tweet. And I wanted to ask Alison to start us off, why do you think this is the case? And what, in your view, are the main protection priorities in Central African Republic that MINUSCA should be addressing? Alison.
Thanks very much for having me, Wendy. I really appreciate it. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. I think it's really unfortunate that this was the inaugural tweet. There were other statements by the SRSG that prioritized protection in the statements. I think this is indicative, though, of a challenge that we don't just see in the Central African Republic, but also in other atrocity situations like in South Sudan. And that's the fact that we are currently asking peacekeeping operations to do far too much at the same time. And that creates two obstacles to success protection. So the first is that we're asking them to do protection of civilians along with a number of other goals, whether it's elections, the extension of state authority, state building, and this dilutes resources. When you have these many objectives, the peacekeeping operation has to go out and actually help do force protection. Those troops that are out there doing force protection for the civilian components that are doing all of these other support activities have to be supplied, which also takes additional air assets. And this is particularly true in contexts like Central African Republic and South Sudan, where the infrastructure makes it very difficult to do supply by road, et cetera. So there really is a trade-off between protecting civilians with your military and even your civilian assets with your other goals of the state building or the extension of state authority. But the other reason why it creates a challenge is it means that the peacekeeping operation has to really partner with the host state government, even when that host state government may itself be involved or implicated in abuses. This creates a challenge for the peacekeeping operation to be able to balance the tensions and trade-offs between protecting civilians in an impartial manner and supporting the host state government stand up. So what a number of people are beginning to propose, what we've been proposing from beginning, is a more sequenced or phased approach, where first you try and put your troops and your police and your civilian components down that are necessary for the protection of civilians. And I do want to emphasize the civilian component because I think that often gets left out in humanitarian and human rights advocacy for protecting civilians. So we're talking about different mechanisms within a peacekeeping operation. I think the Human Rights Division of Peacekeeping Operations is particularly important, but in addition to that, you have joint mission analysis centers, which are the mechanisms within a peacekeeping operation that gather all of the information that should be tasked with understanding the threats, their motivations, the perpetrators, the motivations and tactics of those perpetrators, the vulnerable populations, the perceptions of communities of not only the threats and the perpetrators, but also of the peacekeeping operation themselves, because that speaks to their credibility, legitimacy, and their ability to actually protect. You need POC advisors, protection of civilians advisors, and I would suggest units. It shouldn't just be one advisor, the SRSG, but larger mechanisms. There needs to be a mechanism to do harm mitigation tracking and also advising so that there's more of a do no harm aspect. And this is particularly true either when you're using more force in a situation but also where you're working in tight urban environments where the peacekeeping operations are under threat themselves and therefore have to respond in these very complex environments like we see in the Central African Republic in ways that may cause harm to communities. We need a lot more of early warning civilian capacity within these peacekeeping operations, and particularly in situations like the Central African Republic and South Sudan, where the violence is very much at the local level and things have become extremely polarized, there needs to be a really large component that's looking at conflict prevention, mediation, and reconciliation from the bottom up. And that we haven't quite gotten to the place in peacekeeping operations where we have the right balance between the top down and the bottom up approach when it comes to reconciliation. There's a lot more invested in sort of the national level. And so these are some of the priorities that I think need to be emphasized right now. There has been some progress. MINUSCA has created a protection of civilians strategy in these months that were leading up to the rehatting of the troops. They are trying to put in some mechanisms for greater harm mitigation. They are currently recruiting a protection of civilians advisor. It takes a very long time to recruit civilian capacity for a number of reasons that need to be addressed within UN. And I don't yet know the status of how they are setting up the human rights due diligence policy, but that definitely needs to be done before there's any assistance given to any of the security sector in the Central African Republic, given that there's so little knowledge about who has and has not been implicated in some of the abuses. And I think that the mandate for MINUSCA is moving in the right direction. It does begin to sequence priorities. It actually said that there were a number of priority tasks that need to happen and then some additional tasks that need to happen later on. This is a real improvement because sometimes you get just a list of 56 tasks where the UN Security Council says protection should be prioritized, but then there's not really any indication of how that's going to happen in a sequenced approach. So mandate did take the sequenced approach, but in the priorities, they still have 29 priority activities, some of which were about immediate protection of civilians and some of which are about protection of civilians that needs to happen farther down the line because it requires more assessment. I don't want to take up too much time. I can more questions in the Q&A about sort of where we are in troops and police, but I really do think that this is the approach that we need to start taking, which is phasing or sequencing peacekeeping operations so that the immediate protection needs are taken care of up front and where there's more of an emphasis on the civilian aspects, not just the troops and the police.
Thanks very much, Alison.